Hi, welcome to my channel on the history of the Los Angeles area. This is the second video in a series about the life of missionary Junipero Serra. We pick up the story in 1749. Serra is a respected Catholic priest on the island of Majorca, where he was born. Now in his mid-30s, he's been a member of the Franciscan order since he was 15. He teaches theology at a local university, preaches, and performs other pastoral duties. He remains close to his parents, who still live in their small village where they work in a farm. He has a sister, Juana, and he is close to his nephew, Miguel, who will later become a priest as well. But Serra believes he is called to do more. He wants to be a missionary in Spain's vast overseas empire. And this is clearly a huge decision for him. He has never left the island of Majorca, which is about the size of Rhode Island. When he leaves, he will almost certainly never see home again. And in fact, he doesn't even tell his parents to their face what he's going to do. He leaves a note for another priest to read to them. Oh yes, that's read to them, not give to them. They are humble farmers in a village. They probably can't read or write. In August of 1749, Serra and two other Majorcan priests, Francisco Palou and Juan Crespi, leave Majorca for Spain and then take a boat for San Juan, Puerto Rico. They arrive on October 18th. We have a letter from Serra himself where he describes the journey from Spain to Puerto Rico. What's interesting is he really chastises himself for his behavior during the several weeks it takes to cross the Atlantic. He says he was very impatient with himself, with other priests, and the crew. He doesn't give any details on exactly what happened, but this tendency to be self-critical will come in later in the story. San Juan in the mid-18th century is a freewheeling port city of about 4,000 people. 20% of them are African slaves. It is a major stop on the trade routes between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Before they continue their journey on to Mexico, Serra and the other priests decide to hold a sort of revival meeting on the streets of San Juan. This was not unusual at the time, and there was a kind of method to it. One priest would give a sermon that was meant to be very emotional, a real appeal to the heart, and then a second priest would give a more sort of technical sermon on specific points of the Catholic faith. Serra was known for his long but very passionate sermons back in Majorca, so he gave the first sermon. And again, we have Serra's own words on how he did. Anyone who has performed in front of a live audience, acting, singing, giving a speech, knows you want to look out at your audience. You want to see how you're connecting with them. Serra knew this as well, and he tells us how well he did. What he got from the audience was absolutely nothing. Blank stares, stony silence. He notes the second priest, who gave the less emotional sermon, at least got the occasional nod or bit of affirmation. He got nothing. So already, Serra's kind of unhappy with himself. He's disappointed with his behavior during the voyage. He's disappointed with the reception of his preaching. And, today we would say that he chose to be a missionary. He would say God chose him to be a missionary. And he's failing on the job God has given him. Now, the next part of their voyage is from San Juan to Veracruz, and then an overland journey from Veracruz to Mexico City. When they reach Veracruz, Serra decides he is going to walk the 400 kilometers from Veracruz to Mexico City. Yes, on foot. Now, he is accompanied on the foot journey by Francisco Palou, and they find people who give them food and shelter along the way. And they do obviously make it to Mexico City. But somewhere along the line, he is injured. It's not clear exactly how it happened, but one of his legs gets an injury, some kind of wound, which becomes infected, which is obviously very dangerous at this point in time. Now, he survives the infection, but it apparently becomes chronic because it's going to come up later. It's, in fact, going to bother him for the rest of his life. Finally, they reach Mexico City and report to the Apostolic College. This is an institution created by the Franciscan order to train missionaries. Normally, it's a 1-year course, but Serra, Palou, and Crespi get 6 months of training and then are just sent out into the field. Their first assignment is an area called Sierra Gorda, an area north of Mexico City inhabited by the Pama Indians. There, they will preach to the natives on the missions that have already been built in the area. Now, we need to talk about the missions. What were they? What was their purpose? And they combined actually 2 purposes. There was, of course, a religious purpose, but an economic one as well. A mission was a fairly large area which included land to grow crops and raise animals. There would, of course, be a church. There would be living quarters for a number of people. There would be tools and workshops for working with wood, leather, candle making, later wine making, and at many missions, they were really like small, self-sufficient communities. Who was supposed to live on these missions and do all this work? The natives. The natives would be encouraged and later coerced to leave their native villages and live on the missions. As soon as they arrived, 3 things would happen. They would be baptized as Christians. They would also be given European-style clothing to wear. They would begin to learn the Spanish language, and they would basically get what we might call vocational training on plowing, animal husbandry, crafts, various skills, all, of course, in the European style, differently from their native style. Now, why do this? Well, by the 1750s, the Spanish Empire had a problem. It covered an enormous area. It's most of South America except for Brazil, Central America, Mexico, parts of the Caribbean. The Spanish also controlled the Philippines and areas in Asia. It's an enormous area, and guess what? When you control a big empire, you got to pay for it. When the Spanish conquered the Aztec and Incas and other peoples, they immediately came into possession of the gold and other precious metals the Aztecs and Incas had already mined. But by the 1750s, that money had pretty much been spent. They needed to turn that territory into land that would produce goods that could be sold overseas, and to turn those colonies into markets for goods from Spain. But even though the Spanish had been in control of this empire for centuries, by the 1750s, many of the indigenous people still lived their traditional lifestyle. they weren't producing anything that, or not very much of anything, that could be sold back in Europe, and they didn't have that much of a need for items sold from Europe. And obviously, didn't really have a cash economy to pay for those things anyway. So, from the Spanish government's point of view, the missions were there simply to bring the natives to a central place, first where they could be controlled and it wouldn't revolt against the Spanish government, and turn them into a workforce. Because the missions, from the government point of view, were completely temporary. They were only going to continue until the natives learned enough Spanish to take orders and could do the work of basically a Spanish peasant. After that, the missions would be broken up and the land would be parceled out to settlers from Spain with ready-made workforce, the natives. Serra stayed in the Sierra Gorda missions from 1750 to 1758. We don't have a lot of documents about his activities during this period, so it's not clear why he eventually left. We do know, as I mentioned earlier, there was conflict between the church authorities and the government over breaking up the missions. The government, of course, always wanted to break up the missions as soon as possible so that they could be put in the hands of private colonists. And church figures such as Serra wanted to make sure that the natives really understood the Christian faith that supposedly they had just converted to. And it almost certainly must have been noted, if not very bothersome, to Serra, because many people at the time pointed out that the natives were being coerced onto these missions. They were being baptized, converted en masse. They almost certainly had very little idea of what the religion was they were agreeing to, other than they were agreeing to a new religion at all. Nonetheless, the church often liked to tout how many natives they had just converted. But of course, Serra was surely just too smart not to realize that the idea that these people had a sincere change of heart was just absurd. So perhaps that's why he left the missions in 1758. He joined a traveling group of friars who went around essentially the same area of what now is Mexico, performing the kind of revival show that he had initially tried in San Juan. And it's interesting, he developed a much more emotional and we might say theatrical form of preaching during this period. It was said he would go into such a frenzy that he would rip his own shirt off. He would take a whip and begin whipping himself. This was to imitate the suffering of Christ on the cross. And this practice, called flagellation, has a long history in Christianity, although it wasn't that common at this point. But we know, or at least the records suggest that people often began weeping along with Serra, and sometimes people would rip their own shirts off and grab the whip and whip themselves. So it's interesting that connection to the congregation that he didn't have in San Juan, he apparently found as a traveling mendicant. That brings us to 1767. So now he's been a traveling friar for several years. He's also occasionally been a member of the Spanish Inquisition, the infamous institution that investigated crimes of heresy. We don't have Serra's own thoughts about his work there. We simply have the Inquisition records of the cases he worked on. Now, one case was of a man who was from Spain, but had emigrated to Mexico, married a native woman, and become very wealthy. And that was fine. Until someone found out that he had abandoned a wife and a child back in Spain. And when he was confronted with this, his reaction was he didn't see why people made a big deal out of sex outside of marriage. Isn't sex just a normal thing to want? I have a feeling the argument did not go well with Serra or church authorities. Another case was one of witchcraft. A woman named Dominga, who lived in a small village, came down with a persistent cough. Her neighbors told her the cough was actually a curse, and it had been placed on her by a local woman named Maria Pascuala. They said Maria and her mother were known for their witchcraft abilities, and the family was of a mixed native and Spanish ancestry. Dominga apparently confronted Maria with this accusation. Maria denied it at first, but at some point confessed that, yes, she was a witch and she had cursed Dominga. She would lift the curse in exchange for a payment. Dominga paid the price. Maria said the curse is lifted. But guess what? The cough came back. And that's when Dominga lodged a complaint with the Inquisition. Of course, looking back at this now, it seems much more like a case of a native healing practices that had survived into the Spanish period. But that's a distinction Serra himself probably wouldn't have made. He saw the native religions as witchcraft, sorcery, and devil worship, essentially. So, where is Serra in his feelings about his career and his mission in 1767? He was on a mission, and he gave it up. Now, as he travels the New World, he sees the Spanish colonists are not good role models in many cases, and the conversions are not sincere. It's interesting to think what might have happened with Serra, except in 1767, a certain event occurs that completely changes his life and gives him the opportunity he's been waiting for. We'll talk about that in the next video, which I hope you'll watch. So subscribe so you'll find out when it's released, and give a like to this video. And if you have any thoughts about the video, feel free to make a comment below. Thank you.